Welcome back, Mr. Goodberry. The First Star Logistics studio is fully equipped and ready to record.
The Bengals' biggest decision this offseason will be with Tee Higgins. The wide receiver completed his fourth season with Cincinnati. Despite having a down year this year, overall, we would say the 4 years have been a success for Tee Higgins and the Cincinnati Bengals. But can you pay him? Should you pay him? And will he accept a Bengals type deal? We're going to look at all of that, the ramifications of paying T, the ramifications of not paying Tee Higgins, and what you would have to do from there, both sides of it, and what ultimately I think the Bengals will decide. This is Bengals on the Brain. I'm Joe Goodberry. The show is brought to you by First Star Logistics. And we're going to get deep in this Tee Higgins discussion, figure out how I feel. People have asked also, how do you think you would do it? Or what's the best way you would handle it? Which I appreciate that you care about my opinion on that. But I'm going to try and toe the line between what I think the Bengals will do, how I think the Bengals see it, plus my own advice or the way I see things here. And we're going to start off first with Tee Higgins. Will be 25 years old on January 18th. So shout out to Tee Higgins, a little early birthday here. The former second-round pick out of Clemson, Tee Higgins, has 257 catches in his career for 3,684 yards and 24 touchdowns. He's also had some very big playoff runs, including the Super Bowl game where he may have won MVP had the Bengals won that. It probably would have been close between Logan Wilson and Joe Mixon as well, who threw a touchdown in that game. Man, you almost forget that play sometimes. But Tee Higgins has been a very good number 2 receiver for the Bengals behind Jamar Chase, and that's not to diminish T at all. I think for a lot of teams, Tee Higgins would be a number 1 receiver in the NFL. In fact, if you bring up the list of teams with 3,000-yard receivers in their first 3 seasons, Tee Higgins is one of them for the Bengals with the likes of A.J. Green and Jamar Chase. And there's a lot of teams that don't have one guy ever. So it is a rarity what T has been able to do. Sure, he dealt with injuries this season, and largely, to be honest with you, he's had about 5 hamstring injuries through the 4 years. That is something to be aware of. I've been asked, is that a concern? Sure, soft tissue injuries that continue to happen, especially for a long-limbed guy like that. He's played about 65% of the total offensive snaps in his 4 years. It does bring up some concern, but I think if he was on the free agent market, teams would not care. They wouldn't care. They would be concerned. They'd be aware of it. But would that stop them from giving out a big contract to Tee Higgins? I do not think so at all, because you rarely get to see a guy like this in free agency. And I would suspect that, this is going to be part of the debate here today. Do you let someone like that enter free agency? What is the fallout of that? Number 1. But number 2, when we've seen big receivers be available for other teams, whether it's Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, or A.J. Brown, they were all traded, right? You don't normally let these guys just walk because receivers become a very premium position in the NFL. And teams that don't have that number 1 guy, or if they don't have the guy with the physical attributes that Tee Higgins does, it makes it very hard on your offense. So I think teams want to get guys like that. And to be honest with you, and we'll get to this point later when we talk about, is it smart to have 2 really good receivers, especially when you have to pay them? I think teams are leaning into that more and more. It's like saying if you had 2 good offensive tackles, would you not pay both because you have 2 of them? Of course you would, because they're good players. They're in their primes. You're going to want to keep them. So that is where we'll start. And that is part of the decision-making for the Bengals, is that they've already paid Joe Burrow. So now we know from this point going forward, and this is something we talked about when Burrow was extended, you have to calculate your cap division a little bit more. How you slice that pizza and hand it out to each position grouping has to be thought out a little bit clearer and have more of a concrete plan when you do it. So if we look directly at wide receiver, the Bengals aren't scheduled to pay very much in this next coming season, and that's because T's not on the books yet. But last year, they had the 11th highest paid wide receiver grouping in the NFL, and that's because T is making $4 million and some change. Jamar Chase being the 5th overall pick is making a decent buck. And then you had Tee Higgins you had Tyler Boyd on the final year of his contract. And the Bengals ranked 11th, and you look at the top 10 teams right here, it's really only the Miami Dolphins that made the playoffs. Is it smart to pay 2 wide receivers? Well, you don't see too many good quarterbacks on that list either. So Tua had a great year, of course, but then you have Justin Herbert, and then you end up getting hurt, and they had a whole thing with their coach that I'm not sure was the right coach for them. So maybe it wasn't a good situation as a whole. We'd have to see. They might just be chargering, and that's the Chargers doing their thing and losing in epic fashion. But the Jaguars also failed to keep it together. The Seahawks, good enough quarterback, but is he a Joe Burrow, right? So as you can see there, not a lot of success from those teams that did pay the wide receiver position a whole lot. Again, does that directly apply to us? Does it mean that it's a bad decision because other teams haven't been able to do it? You have a better quarterback situation. You can make the argument that it would be different here. You have 2 guys entering their primes with Tee Higgins and Jamar Chase, but Jamar Chase is the other factor here. He will be looking for a contract extension this offseason. You can do it starting now. I imagine the Bengals will be very similar to the way they handled Joe Burrow. They'll pick up his 5th-year option, which will be an expensive 5th-year option because Jamar Chase has now made multiple Pro Bowls, 3 Pro Bowls in his first 3 years. I expect that to be like a $30 million a year contract, if not even more by the time it gets to Jamar Chase, because other receivers are in line to get extensions first. So you're going to pay for the remainder of Chase's contract probably a top 10 positional spending for wide receiver. It's almost unavoidable at that point once those big hits happen, and those will happen starting in his 5th year. So you'll have 2024 still where it's relatively cheap. And then 2025, when the 5th year, that's going to be very expensive for him. And then his contract extension really can kick in any point. You can structure it. But the point is, I expect that deal to get done. So with that expectation, how much can you afford to pay a Tee Higgins? And is it worth it? So for the Bengals, I think T is worth less than he would for other teams. A team like the Jaguars, a team like the Chiefs, whoever doesn't have a number 1 type guy. And you may say the Jags have good receivers. They do, but do they have a Tee Higgins? They don't. He would be more valuable to them. They'd be willing to spend more on Tee Higgins than the Bengals would and should, right? Because you're going to spend so much on Jamar. The tag is expected to be about $21 to $22 million to tag Tee Higgins. So if you can't get a deal done, they'll slap the franchise tag on him. That is my expectation of how they'll handle this situation. A $22 million cap hit, fully guaranteed, good money for T. But what does that say about the Bengals roster and the expectations from that standpoint? Because that's a decent amount of money. You're taking them from $4 million to over $20 million. You're 5 times the salary there. Is T going to be able to perform 5 times better than he has before? No, unlikely, right? You're not paying for future performance there. You're paying for past performance. And if you look at past performance, most he's ever had is 74 catches for almost 1,100 yards and 7 touchdowns. Those are his career highs because, again, he's only played about 65% of the offensive snaps in his career, with the highest percentage being his rookie season. So, what would $22 million be worth, statistical production-wise? Because that's paying him as a number 1 receiver. You would need to see 150 targets at least. Maybe not at least. Maybe 135 and up. You need like 85 catches, 1,250 yards, 8 to 10 touchdowns. That would be where it would need to be a career year out of Tee Higgins to justify paying him 5 times his salary, his current salary. And I know that's what he's worth. So I'm not saying he's wrong for asking for that. And I believe that's what he would get, and maybe even more if you were to enter free agency. And that's the definition of worth. What is someone willing to pay you for your services? And I think somebody would be willing to pay Tee Higgins in that range. And if he was the number 1 for another team, he should be able to put up those numbers. I believe that. But for the Bengals, can he put up those numbers? Maybe if your entire focus is Jamar and T, and you pull back a little bit on Tyler Boyd, you pull back a little bit on how many times you're throwing to the running back, you maybe pull back just a little on how much you're throwing to the tight end. The dangers in that is how defenses have played the Bengals over the last few years. Once T and Jamar were established, defenses put the cover two shells up and said, you're not going to beat us over the top with these guys. It's almost forced the Bengals to adjust and start using the running back and the tight end more often, which only dials up the importance of the running back, tight end, slot receiver in this Bengals offense when you have Jamar and T. So it's kind of hard to put so many resources to the guys that are drawing coverage away, and then you go cheap at the positions that are going to have to win it for you. It's a tough predicament to put yourself in. Now, for 1 year, and that's what the salary cap and the franchise tag would allow them to do, you can do it. And it's what I believe they did this year when they said, we're not going to trade Tee Higgins in the offseason. We're not going to do it because we believe we can win the Super Bowl. You're probably looking at a situation like that again in 2024, where they say, you know what, we're getting Burrow back. We had a strong draft. We signed free agents. We slapped the tag on T. We're going to gear up and go for one more year, one more run at this. And I can understand that logic. T helps you win the Super Bowl. Having Tee Higgins increases your chances of winning the Super Bowl. But does Tee Higgins at $22 million increase your chances? It's hard to say. When you look at roster construction around the league and you look how teams pay that position, you look how teams right now value that wide receiver position, 27 wide receivers went over 1,000 yards this year. This is the most ever in league history. Now there is the extra game. But even still, there was only a handful of guys that needed that extra game to hit 1,000. It was still an extremely strong year, and it's trending upwards. While receivers are better than ever, they're more important than ever, there's also more of them than ever. So if the Bengals were to decide, and I guess I've almost jumped a step here. You may be saying to yourself, well, why wouldn't they just extend him? Maybe get that cap hit lower. Because you can do that, right? The cap hit doesn't have to be $22 million. A lot of teams if it was the Browns signing them, they wouldn't have a $22 million cap hit next year. They'd feather it out. They'd probably have void years at the end, which we will talk about roster construction and cap construction at a future point and why the Bengals do things a little bit differently. Not saying it's a good thing, but they do things differently. I don't believe the Bengals can get a deal done with David Mogoletta, Tee Higgins' agent. Same agent as Jessie Bates. I think they're running into the very similar situation as Jessie Bates. I think the Bengals would have paid Bates $14 to $16 million a year. I don't think that was a problem at all. I think the biggest problem is that the way the Bengals structure contracts, and we're going to dip into that a little bit because it ties to Tee Higgins and why this deal is unlikely to get done. The way the Bengals structure contracts is they do not guarantee anything past the first year. So if you're going to get paid $20 million in the first year, they'll give you $20 million and say it's guaranteed, whether through signing bonuses and cash. But the year two is not guaranteed. They'll have bonuses and things like that down the line, roster bonuses. But that's not a guarantee. They'll say it's effectively guaranteed because we won't cut you in year two. Look at Trey Waynes. Got $16 million a year. They guaranteed the first year, did not guarantee the second year. He saw both years. He made us $32 million. It was effectively guaranteed. But effectively guarantee is not as strong as a physical guarantee, contract guarantee, that if anything happens, you're guaranteed to get this amount of money. And that's the king in free agency. Players and agents are looking for the most guaranteed money they can get. So just in case it's a bad fit, just in case that guy gets hurt and he's not the same player, you need to guarantee a certain amount of money. And the Bengals won't do it past the first year. And I think it's pretty silly of them, to be honest with you, because again, they will effectively say you're not getting cut in the first 2 years. So guarantee the first 2 years. It's philosophical at that point. And there is some financial hurdles to that. Any guaranteed money that you put into a contract, you have to sign a check into escrow and put it away so that you're guaranteeing that it'll be there. So the Bengals don't like to do that. So even if they agreed that, let's say, hey T, we think you're worth 20 million and we're going to stomach this and we're going to pay Jamar Chase and Tee Higgins and Joe Burrow and we're going to go short on the offensive line or at tight end or at running back, whatever you want to choose. Because again, it's all part of a pie. If I give one player a bigger piece, I've got to take some from another position. If I give so much to the wide receiver position, I've got to take some from another position. So even if the Bengals agreed and they said, how about 3 years, $60 million, $20 million a year. We'll guarantee the first year, $20 million you'll get in the first year. Why would T agree to that? Because a franchise tag could be $22 million. So that guarantees $22 million. And then he can go into free agency in 2025 and probably get $45 million, $50 million, $60 guaranteed. So the Bengals would have to not only give them a structure the way they do for Joe Burrow. And listen, that's the thing. I expect, if you're saying, well, won't this hurdle keep them from signing Jamar Chase? I expect them to break it the way they did for Joe Burrow. I expect them to give the guaranteed money to Jamar Chase. Jamar's actually made these comments that the guaranteed and upfront money is the biggest thing to him. So the Bengals better change the way they do it. And I expect it. But is Tee Higgins Jamar Chase? Is Tee Higgins Joe Burrow? As much as we like the guy, we have to say he isn't, right? So once you start going from your superstars to your next tiered players, the Tee Higgins, the Jessie Bates, if you're giving a certain contract to the superstars and the next guys also want that, you have to draw the line somewhere if this is a stance you're willing to make. Now, I think the Bengals need to modernize and get off of it. If they like T and they're okay with paying the yearly salary, then guarantee his money. He's been a good player for you. He's someone you selected, homegrown talent, and you're going to let him walk because of a difference in how you structure contracts? That's why you let Jessie Bates walk? That's worth it? Not in my opinion, it isn't. So here are the two things. You can tag T, keep him for the year, try and build it up, and do your best to go and make a run at this thing in 2024. What are the ramifications if you do it? If you're paying T 5 times his salary, I said now you have less of the pie to go elsewhere. Joe Burrow's taking now a bigger slice every year of his contract. So now you pay your receivers and you pay Jamar Chase. Even if it's 1 year, you plan on paying Jamar Chase this year, he's going to get a raise of some sort. So you tag T and you pay Jamar. And now that position grouping plus the quarterback is going to be worth a lot of your cap. They're eating most of that pizza. And the defensive end group with Hendrickson and Hubbard making a decent deal. And the first round pick in Miles Murphy, that's a decent salary you're paying out at defensive end. But you're going cheap at safety. You're going cheap at corner, other than Mike Hilton. I believe they plan on going cheap at running back. They're already currently allocating $0 to the tight end room. That'll change, but I don't expect it to be one of the top paid tight end rooms in the league if you're keeping Tee Higgins even for a year. They have projected 68 to 70 million to spend. So don't make it seem like they don't have a lot of money. They do. But they have a lot of holes as well. If you let Jonah Williams walk, you need a starting right tackle. If you let DJ Reader walk, you need a starting nose tackle. And in fact, they probably need 2 or 3 defensive tackles. They could probably use a veteran corner that can come in and start. Someone that maybe making $5, $6, $7 million. Maybe he doesn't have to be a starter, but he's got to be a guy that can come in. Cam Taylor-Britt was hurt this year. He dealt with things his rookie year as well. Remember, he missed the first half with that hamstring. DJ Turner, not the best rookie season. We're hopeful, but you'd like to have another guy to rotate in there. They're not very deep at that position because DJ Ivey had a severe knee injury late in this rookie campaign. We don't know when he'll be back. Hopefully he's a young man. It's right before camp opens up. But if not, again, you need that depth. I could see them bringing in a veteran safety, someone other than Nick Scott. So after they cut, if we're expecting them to cut Nick Scott and Joe Mixon, they'll add another $8 million to that. So you'll have room to add that safety, to add a corner, to add a low-end defensive tackle. But the money does dry up fairly quickly when you give $22 million to T and a big extension. We don't know what the cap number will be this year, but it'll be an increase for Jamar Chase. It's more about the future years and what it means if you were to extend Tee Higgins. If you were to extend Tee Higgins, whew. I mean, we're talking the difference of going from $4 million to $20 million a year is basically the difference of adding Alex Kappa and Ted Karras to your offensive line. You're no longer able to afford T, Kappa, and Karras. And I don't mean it has to be Kappa and Karras, but guys like that, because in a couple of years, if you were to extend T and you need to replace Kappa and Karras, you have to do it with draft picks. Guys that aren't making a lot of money. Because now that money is going to T. And that's just how roster construction works. There is a balance of how many high-end contracts can we afford. If the more you afford on the high-end contracts, the more you fit under the cap, the more rookies, the more cheap talent, the more cheap options you need to play on your team. Starters, depth players, role players. This past year in 2023, the Bengals got 8,000 snaps from players on rookie contracts. Cheap talent. Guys like Miles Murphy, Dax Hill, Jordan Battle, Cam Taylor-Britt, DJ Turner, Cordell Volson, so on and so on to the depth guys. Tee Higgins as well, still on his rookie deal. Those 8,000 snaps ranked 32nd in the league. The Bengals got some of the least amount of cheap talent starting for them in the league. When you pay a Tee Higgins, you're now relying on that portion to grow. And it becomes very risky. Now, if they don't pay Tee Higgins, or if they tag Tee Higgins and trade Tee Higgins, or if they tag Higgins and let him walk in a year, any of those options where he's not part of your long-term plans, this team should draft a wide receiver. At some point, it doesn't have to be in the first round, but second, third round. Maybe not this year. Maybe the offense changes completely. And maybe it should. Maybe they shouldn't be so reliant on 2 wide receivers. Like I said, the issues with how the defense can defend 2 receivers without having a really good tight end or a really good running back, a dynamic tight end or a dynamic running back. So maybe T walks, and now you spend your first round pick on a tight end. Maybe you trade T and you use that pick to get a good receiver in here. What do I think T's trade value would be? I think it would be less than A.J. Brown and Tyreek Hill and Devontae Adams. Number one, those guys have put up bigger individual seasons than T has. Number one, I think those guys put up bigger individual seasons than T has in his career. It's like eye test. I can tell T looks like a number one, and teams will covet what he does. And he's young, super young. But the difference between A.J. Brown is A.J. Brown had one more cheap year on his contract. T does not. You'd be putting a tag on him with $22 million. Has to be guaranteed to whoever you send him, wherever you send him. That lessens his value. Because you don't have as much leverage as when you had the Titans would have had with A.J. Brown. Plus, the Titans got ripped for it, right? The fallout from trading A.J. Brown to now, and they cleaned house with the GM and coach. And it's not all A.J. Brown, but ever since the Bengals beat them in that playoff when they had the number 1 seed and Mike Vrabel's winning coach of the year that year, they haven't been the same. But this is about Tee Higgins. If you don't pay him, if you don't keep him for the extended future, maybe those resources go to the offensive line. Maybe Yoshi and Charlie Jones can step up into these roles. And then you draft one. Or you sign a receiver for about $5 million. About what T was making. Sure, you're going to get worse there. But it's a veteran guy that can step in and play. And you spend a draft pick at a receiver. You spend a draft pick or use that money and sign a tight end. You could, for $20 million, $22 million for the cap, you could sign a $5 million veteran receiver, a $5 million running back, and then spend $10 million on the best tight end on the market. You upgrade 2 positions, running back and tight end. You may get worse at receiver, but that may not be worse for your offense if you get better at 2 other positions. And then you still, to the Bengals' credit, they've been one of the best drafting teams when it comes to receiver throughout their history. Would you rather them be forced to, let's say you pay Tee Higgins, and now you're forced to use draft picks to replace Kappa and Karras. You need to spend draft picks to get a center and right guard to protect Joe Burrow. Or you continue to spend veteran money on the offensive line. You take that money from T and you spend it on a right tackle, Michael Onwenu, let's say. Do you trust the team more to draft a replacement wide receiver, or do you trust them more to draft 2 replacement linemen? I think we all would probably answer the same thing there. I'm kind of split 2 ways here because I don't like letting homegrown talent walk. After you draft Tee Higgins, and he's exactly what you expect his rookie season, you're very happy with his output. You turn around and you draft Jamar Chase right after. You almost made the decision there. Unless you're saying we're going to win it with these 3 in the next 3 years, and that's it, which would be weird. But you make that decision, you pay the guys. You pay them both. You built this team. It reminds me of Kevin Zeitler. They draft him. He becomes everything you expect him to be. But because you don't agree on salary structure, you don't even offer him a contract extension because you know he won't accept it because he's going to get paid huge money out there. He's still playing and playing very well. You drafted him in the first round. He was everything you imagined he would be. And you let him walk. Same with Jessie Bates. Guys like Jonathan Joseph, right? You draft Jonathan Joseph and Leon Hall. Now I may be going back too far for some of you guys, but you go and take those guys back-to-back years in the first round. And then when it comes down to it, you give one of them a contract extension. I mean, don't you like having a position of strength that you don't worry about? That you know when we go out on the field, no matter who it's against, our guys are better than yours. And you're jealous that we've got these 2 guys, right? Go draft your own. Go find your own Tee Higgins. Quote from Duke Tobin last combine, I think that was. At the same time, the writing on the wall is that they will tag him and then let him walk in 2025. Then trade him and get what you can for him. Get assets. Remember, you let a big free agent walk, you can potentially get a 3rd-round compensatory pick. The Bengals were in line to get a 3rd-round compensatory pick for the loss of Jessie Bates, but they signed Orlando Brown Jr. to a similar contract, and they lost that 3rd-round pick. So they let Bates go for nothing. They didn't even get that 3rd-round pick back at all. They got nothing for him. That stinks. I mean, he's going to be an all-pro safety this year, and you let him walk. The same thing could happen for Tee Higgins. You can let him walk and another team signs him, and you have now money, so you spend it out, let's say, defensive tackle, and you get nothing for T. I don't feel like good teams would do that. When you have a young, valuable asset, because we agreed, well, I said it, and I think you guys agree in the beginning, that T would get paid handsomely. He would get a big contract if he hit free agency. So you know he has value, and he is valued around the league. Then get value for him. Get a pick for him. I don't care if it's a 33rd pick from the Panthers. Take it. Try to get something else. Try and get a 5th or something thrown in there. Sweeten it up. But you take it and you draft another receiver. You take it and you take a tight end. You take it and you get a right tackle in here. You take it and you get a defensive tackle in here. You need young, cheap labor. This team really needs it, especially on the offensive line. You can't continue to pay 3 veteran salaries. Because remember, they ended up with a top 5 paid O-line, D-line last year, and we're either good enough, you're paying top 5 for your O-line and D-line last year. Were any of them good enough? That's what happens when you have to pay veterans because you can't draft that position. They're in line to do that again if they can't draft a defensive tackle and a right tackle this year. Or have them go into free agency and load up at those positions and pay them. That means no T. So it's a hard decision. There's a lot on the table. A lot of it is the Bengals' way they do contracts, and would T accept it? And as of right now, he won't. But maybe there's hope there. Maybe it's a TJ Watt situation, if you don't remember that, where the agent and the Steelers, who also structure contracts very similarly to the Bengals, were at an impasse. And TJ said, enough. I'm not holding out. I'm going in there to sign this contract. This is more than enough. Could the same thing happen with T? Is there any... Joe Burrow continues to talk about, and I got this question as well. Joe Burrow keeps saying, we talked about it with the organization when I was signing my deal. There's provisions put in there. There's nothing, like, we don't see the full contract. We just get the numbers, but there's no guarantee that the team is going to keep these guys. It just means they're going to try. Okay. I think Joe would like to keep Tee Higgins and Jamar Chase together, even if that means you have to draft a right tackle instead of signing one. Even if that means you have to draft a tight end instead of signing one. Even if that means you have to draft a running back instead of signing one. So do you just do what your quarterback wants, bite the bullet, and figure out how to draft in the trenches finally to save this franchise and your quarterback? I'm Joe Goodberry. This is Bengals on the Brain, brought to you by First Star Logistics. What would you do with Tee Higgins, number one? What is probably the smart move to do with Tee Higgins? Because that might be 2 different things. You may be thinking with your heart and your head there. And then finally, what do you think the Bengals do with T? Leave it in the comments. I read all your comments, so I appreciate all the discussion that happens in there. Leave it in there, and I got some stuff I got to give away. So maybe the best comment will win on that one. And we'll see you on Tuesday for Bengals on the Brain. Who dat?
Dave Lapham here, and every day I am grateful for my experience to have played professional football. As a player, I realize self-motivation, leadership, and appreciating your teammates are key. At First Star Logistics, you can use those same attributes to create the life you want for you and your family. Build your future by working hard like I did. You'll see results both on and off the field. Call First Star Logistics today and be part of our winning team.
Opportunity knocking.